Okay, well, as the numbers keep building up and I'm watching them, I'm just going to say kia ora koutou katoa and welcome to Privacy Live. No mai, haere mai, ki te hui o tēnei wā. My name is Liz MacPherson. My pronouns are she, her, and I am just delighted to welcome you to this Privacy Live, which is focused on gender affirming data collection. It's a critical aspect of privacy. Privacy, one of the things about privacy is that it safeguards some of our core human values, which are about identity, freedom, protection, and trust. And it actually gives us the space to figure out who we are and what we think and what we believe, and that space in which we can share it with our intimates and our confidence as we develop that. So when we're thinking about gender data, it's particularly important that that data is collected where it's necessary. It needs to be accurate, because if you can't do that, it can do more harm than good. We know that in the case of gender data, binary forms and fields, that's male and female, misrepresent whole communities of people and can render them invisible. This can be hurtful, it can force people to lie or even out themselves before they're ready, and can mean that they miss out on services that they need and deserve. So I've got a fantastic panel here to help us talk about these issues. Do you need to collect gender data at all? If you do, how do you build systems that can do it in an affirming and inclusive way? I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So starting at the top of my screen, Max.
Kia ora everyone, thank you so much for having me today. So my name's Max Whitehurst, my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I'm trans, I'm Pākehā, my ancestors are from Scotland, Ireland, and England. And I'm hoping to be able to contribute today from both my personal perspective as a trans person. So navigating these forms is just part of my day-to-day life and figuring out how to answer them, as well as my professional perspective. I work in sexual health in the community, so navigating quite intimate data and managing to collect that in a way that's both private, safe, and also accurate for those services that we're providing is something that we're constantly navigating as well. So yeah, thanks so much for having me today.
Kia ora. Claire, you're next as I go around.
Kia ora koutou, my name is Claire Black. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a cisgender Pākehā queer woman, and for nearly 3 years I've been the general manager at Outline Aotearoa, which is an all ages nationally available rainbow mental health organisation, and we partner with Spark on many things, but including the Beyond Binary Code that we're going to talk about today. And I have a really long-standing interest in the intersections of data and tech and rainbow experiences, because media and technology can be so liberating for our communities, but it's also often designed in ways that doesn't factor in those experiences, identities, or even safety of the people using them. So really keen to talk about this aspect of that today.
Kia ora. Thanks, Claire. George.
Thanks, Liz. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko George Parker tuku ingoa. I'm a Pākehā queer non-binary person. My pronouns are they, them. I'm also a lecturer in health service delivery at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And through my role there, I'm the lead investigator on the Health Research Council of New Zealand funded trans pregnancy care project studies. So really excited to share some of our reflections on gender data collection filtered through our learnings and primarily in that research project today, and also some of my own personal reflections as a non-binary person navigating healthcare for myself and my family. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks George. And Sarah.
Kia ora. My name is Sarah Auva'a. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm lead digital trust partner at Spark. Passionate about privacy, and when this project came up, really excited about the opportunity to work on something which I know is really close to so many people's hearts, and it really brings privacy to life in a meaningful way. So, and very grateful to be here today on this panel. Thank you.
Kia ora. Well, great that we finished up with you, Sarah, because actually your project, the project that you and Claire worked on, was the starting off point for this whole session. You developed at Spark with Outline, developed a project around, which is called Beyond Binary, and it is focused on whether you collect gender data, and then if you do, how you can collect it in a way that is, as the title says, beyond binary. So we're delighted to have you here to talk about it, because so often people say this is all too hard. So I'm going to start with you first, Sarah, and just say, so why did Spark, what is the Beyond Binary Code? How does it work? Why did Spark go there?
So what is it? It's really an online resource or tool, and it's a set of information, including code, that helps businesses and organisations decide and think about gender data. So really thinking about, why do they need it? What are they actually using it for? What would their customers expect them to use it for? Would they be surprised? And so there's a set of resources. First up, some guidance on how to actually decide if your organisation really needs to collect gender data. And that includes a series of questions that you can think through from your organisation's perspective as to, what are you collecting? Why? For example, if you're collecting because you need to provide reporting to a regulator on gender and people using your services, that might be relevant. But if you're actually collecting it to decide what are your customers' preferences, maybe you don't need it. Maybe there's some other data points that you would actually be able to use more usefully instead. And then if you decide you do need to collect gender data, then the platform actually has a HTML code that you can use and add to your website. That means that your data fields are actually more gender inclusive and affirming. We've worked with Outline, which has been amazing, and also used research from Stats New Zealand, Human Rights Commission, and other organisations to try to get the right fields. But of course, we're always going to be open to feedback. If people are saying it should look a little bit different, that's something we would keep on working on. And then as well as that, we have something dear to my heart, which is a gender data privacy guide. So actually saying, if you're collecting the data, you need to be transparent. You need to tell people why you're collecting it, what you're going to use it for. You need to make sure that your employees know that it needs to be treated really carefully and what it can be used for, consistent with what you've told people. How you're going to keep it safe, how you're going to let people access it if they need to, and find out what gender you're holding about them, and also how they might update it if they want to. As well as that, something which I think is an awesome resource is a guide on how, if you're looking to achieve change in your organisation, a PowerPoint pack that you could use to talk some of your key stakeholders through why it's important, what customers are thinking in the space, and how you can bring about the change. And then most importantly, for people like me who aren't so tech focused, guidance on how to actually apply and use the code on your website, which I think is super important as well.
Right.
And so, sorry.
Keep going.
I was just going to say, in terms of the RAI, I mean, it's a really exciting piece of work, and privacy touches everything we do. But it was, we do know that data really helps businesses design better, more intuitive customer products and services and better customer experiences. But if we're collecting the wrong data, or data that we don't need, it can really upset our customers. It can cause a lot of mistrust, and it also creates some legal risk under the Privacy Act sometimes as well. And we know from feedback that's especially the case for gender data. And so at Spark, we felt that we really did have an opportunity in the organisation and our capabilities to look at how could we help New Zealanders have a better relationship with data. And we felt starting with gender representation was a great place. So we worked with Outline. But our aspiration is really to not only look at our own practices, but we're sort of thinking outwardly, what can we do to help other organisations perhaps refresh their practices and think about it as well. And so that's where sharing the code and the resources became the big dream. So we're really hoping people on the call today might take some information back and have reflections back in their own organisations that might start to make a difference as well.
Great. So before I just go to you, Claire, just a promo. If you want to check out the Beyond Binary code, you do go to spark.co.nz and just Beyond Binary, and it's there.
Yes, so /online and then /Beyond Binary Code.
Yeah, okay, cool.
And if you Google Spark Beyond Binary Code, you'll find it as well.
Find it anyway. Claire, I know that you worked really closely with Spark on the Beyond Binary Code, and my memory is that that there was some research behind this. Do you want to talk to that research?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was something that we were aware of as a really significant issue for non-binary communities, just through the work that we do and the connections that we have anyway. But as part of this process, we wanted to consult with non-binary people in as many different ways as possible. And part of that was putting out this survey that was asking about experiences having gender data collected in various different ways online. And there were some not surprising, but I think really important results that came from that survey. Some of the ones that really stick out to me in terms of emphasizing how much of an issue this is for these communities. Of the respondents, 85% felt often or always misrepresented when sharing their gender information online. So that kind of speaks to the scope of so many forms do default to male, female, or maybe male, female, other, which is a third option, but is a really othering one that doesn't recognize that non-binary identities are kind of on par with man and woman, that those aren't the only two significant options. So that was a really cool finding, was that this might be a small group who face this particular issue of not being able to fit into the man or woman boxes, but it's a really significant one for them, and also has flow-on effects for the rest of us. Another thing that really stuck out to me, I think sometimes when we talk about data collection, there's so much data that's collected on all of us that we think, well, people don't necessarily care that much about their privacy because there's not that much you can always do. But we asked, how important is it to you that companies and organizations use your data safely and protect your data privacy? And the respondents to this survey, 28% of them said it was important, and 72% said it was extremely important. And no one said that it wasn't important. So I think that speaks to the fact that this is a really important issue that affects people's logistical interactions with the world, that affects people's safety. If people are going to be collecting, if businesses are going to be collecting gender data, it's really important that there's an explanation of not just why, and kind of thinking about that rather than taking for granted that it's a data point you're entitled to, but having a really clear reason for what it's used for and being able to communicate that. And then making sure it's optional in most circumstances. There are very, very few instances where you absolutely have to have that data. And it's about giving the autonomy to the people interacting to decide, okay, well, if you need it for this purpose, I understand it, I'll give it to you. Or actually, it's not worth that trade-off to me, so I'm going to step away. And one final finding that really stood out to me was that when asking people how they feel when they're accurately represented, some people said happy, euphoric, satisfied, but the top result was actually relieved. So that speaks to the fact that this is kind of a bare minimum. It's not something that's amazing for non-binary people. It's something that's actually just bringing the floor up so they're not feeling really negative and misrepresented when they're interacting with your business.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Claire. I mean, one thing my people will be really grumpy with me about is that at the very beginning of the session, I should have said to you that if you want to ask a question that I can put to the panel, please put it in the Q&A. We won't be using the chat for that. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A there. We have, what I'll do is at the end of the session, we'll actually focus on those questions and come back to them then. In terms of the reaction of the non-binary community to the code, I was just interested in what your feedback has been, Sarah, and also just to Max and to George, if you've had a chance to actually have a look at the forms and things, how do you feel about that? So I've actually had some things in the questions so far already saying, you know, how does this relate to some of the stuff that's come through from stats? And I know, Sarah, you've said that you based a lot of the forms on the work that had been done there, but you first, Sarah, and then perhaps Max and George on that.
Yeah, look, we've had a lot of positive feedback, but obviously really keen to hear what others think today and to reflect on that as well. But yeah, it's been very positive. Mm-hmm.
Max.
Yeah, I was quite interested in this point as well, because I think our communities, like any other communities, are characterized by dissensus. You know, we have different intersections with other communities, and so that's going to inform how we respond to stuff. And I think I've had a look at the website myself, but one thing that I wanted to hear from is in these forms, is there like a third option that is being suggested, or is it like a blank field, or is that something that people navigate with their own services, or yeah, how is that part of the work that you've been doing?
I haven't got the forms in front of me, but I'm pretty sure there were 5 or 6 fields, I think. Claire,
I can speak to this a little bit. So there is not just one question that the code addresses. One of the things that it kind of steps you through is, well, what are you actually asking for? A lot of the times for marketing, maybe you need a name. In some instances, if you know that you're going to be interacting and talking about a person, perhaps you want the option for them to give pronouns. Gender is one that's quite far down the list of like, are you sure you need it? Really? Are you sure? And for the gender list, we've got man, woman, non-binary, takatapui, and other, sort of a fill in the blank, to make sure that we kind of are recognizing and affirming those two particularly relevant identities or umbrella identities for Aotearoa, but also that people can put in whatever they want if they don't feel sort of sufficiently represented. And the other thing that's really key about that field is that it has optional, to really stress that like you almost certainly don't have to have gender as an option.
Yeah. Perhaps if we return to that point, and I would just reflect on the point that Max made earlier. George, sorry, did you want to reflect on the form aspect?
Yeah, I mean, really just to affirm, both as a non-binary person and doing healthcare research with non-binary people, just the urgent need to be making spaces. You know, I feel like as academics in this space, we're quite good at carving out the problem and articulating it, and that's the work that we're doing. And what's exciting to me about what Spark and Outline are doing is constructing a set of solutions, which is, you know, we are desperately needed, because I think we're starting to build up a recognition that we need to do this work, and the next step is, well, how do we do this work? Acknowledging the dissensus, as you beautifully articulate, Max, because we've seen that process with Stats New Zealand, a long and difficult process to achieve a degree of dissensus about how that was going to be collected. But yeah, just an affirmation. If we're not on the forms, then we don't exist, we're not visible, and we're seeing a very strong picture of implications emerge in the healthcare setting from that level of erasure around gender. Kia ora.
Great. Kia ora. Thank you for that, George. And I think it is, as Sarah pointed out, this is one solution, but this will have to evolve, and it needs to evolve in conversation with the community. As you both articulated so clearly, there is that element of dissensus, but the more that we're all focused on making sure that we can, to the extent possible, hold up a mirror to Aotearoa, and that everyone can see themselves in it, so much the better. Sarah and Claire, I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you did say, which was often people just assume that it's absolutely necessary to collect gender information. It's a no-brainer, you have to. I'm really conscious of the fact that Spark now makes it clear that it doesn't collect gender information. How hard was it for Spark to reach the conclusion that from a marketing perspective that wasn't necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something which had evolved over many decades. And to be honest, we weren't collecting that much anyway. And at Spark, we actually have what we call a Blue Heart program, which is employee focused, very much about being inclusive in what we do, celebrating diversity, and really making sure everyone has a voice. We're also very committed to privacy. And so those two, I guess, foundational parts of what we think and believe in at Spark made it a really easy conversation. So people could really see, oh, well, I guess people hadn't really turned their minds to it. And once there were only a couple of pockets of the business we identified that were still collecting it, and almost without thinking. And so once we turned our minds to it, there really wasn't any reason. So there's no kind of downside to stop collecting it. It's just a matter of making it happen. And like I would say, it's always a journey, because you never know that somebody might create a new form and without thinking put it in there, but we'll be watching for that, and we continue to educate ourselves and everybody and so on. So it's a journey. We're not saying we're perfect, but we are very conscious of it, and we want to do as well as we can do in this space. But it wasn't something which we received any people saying, oh no, we must keep on collecting it or anything like that.
Okay, great. Obviously, from a privacy perspective, we very much focused on lawful purpose. And so is there a purpose for collecting this information? You know, if there is, then, you know, we need to go out of our way to try and make it as accurate as possible. And we also need to be really transparent about the fact that the information's been collected and what it's been used for. So I really want to move on from a situation where Spark has effectively said, well, for the bulk of things, we don't need to collect gender data, to focusing on the field that George and Max both tend to work in, which is health, where there is a critical need to accurately collect gender. And I was interested when I was looking through the Beyond Binary research and documents that there was a term which was a quote that effectively said that that gender is a small data point, but the way that gender data is collected has a really big ripple effect. And I wanted to just know whether, from your perspectives, you think that's true and why. So I might start with you, George.
Sure, Liz. I absolutely agree that that was true. There's a beautiful quote by a trans masculine person who was having a baby in a study that we've used to inform our trans pregnancy care project here in Aotearoa. And he said, more options on the forms means that there is more space in people's minds. And I think that really beautifully brings to life that point you've made, Liz, that, yeah, it may seem like such a small moment in a form seeking to collect health information about a person, but has the ability to literally erase or make visible a person and connect them to their healthcare counter. And we've been hearing that so incredibly strongly in our perinatal care research. The challenge in healthcare settings like the ones that we're looking at, so looking at fertility, reproduction, early parenting related healthcare, is that we've seen a tradition of, you know, a massive kind of conflation of sex assigned at birth with gender. So we've seen those things conflated, and when we're collecting gender data, what has usually been assumed is that sex assigned at birth and gender are aligned and that they're the same thing. And so in the perinatal care space, an assumption that if you're there, an assumption, kind of wholesale assumption made about what your gender is. And so when we've been talking to trans and non-binary takatapu and other gender diverse people, going through those kinds of healthcare encounters, a really strong need to differentiate between sex assigned at birth and gender to allow visibility and people to be known to their health care providers and in those healthcare settings, and to be able to have some degree of self-determination to self-identify what their gender is. We've seen gender diverse whānau articulate a really amazing broad range of different ways of identifying. And so thinking back to that opening quote I mentioned, you know, this is about the more space we provide for self-identification, the more space there are in healthcare providers' minds of who's in front of them and what they bring and what they need. Yeah, kind of when collecting gender data, allowing, you know, creating space in data systems to not only self-identify gender, but also things like Claire mentioned pronouns, preferred names, and making those kind of exist in data systems where they're visible to providers, where they're translated at handovers and are immediately kind of triggered for people stepping in and being involved in people's care. The emotional labor, the distress of constantly having to come out about your gender and healthcare encounters, to self-advocate, to be known, to have that translated from carer to carer to carer. Our participants in our research, you know, they couldn't emphasize more the accumulative effects that has on them in disintegrating their trust in their healthcare and kind of not wanting to be there, and accumulative effects of mental distress, I guess, that sense of being unintelligible to services, being invisible, being told that you don't exist, that services aren't for you. And that really accumulated across the care journeys of our participants. And I don't know if I have time, but I do have a couple of really powerful small quotes from our research lids, but I'm happy to kind of come back to that if there's time, or share those. But
how about you share them right now, and then we'll go to
yeah. Beautiful. So one of our gender diverse whānau said, "I was never asked what my gender identity was. Like, it was never on the form. There was nothing in there about pronouns. There was nothing in there about gender and sexuality. And there was no acknowledgement really that we exist. Like, it's total erasure. That's the thing. There was just nothing." So that was a very strong and repetitive theme that we've heard across our participants. And another said, "I did have to fill in a form, and I made myself a little box of, please refer to me as MX, and my pronouns are they, them." And the person at reception went, "Oh, thank you. We really need to update our forms." And I said, "Thank you so much. That would be great." And the letter they sent out to me still said she, and they sent it to Ms. Jessie. And I think we hear that a lot. Yes, we need data capture that captures gender diversity, but we also need to make sure that the ways that we're collecting data are translating into practice, and so that, please collect data that captures gender diversity, but tie it into day-to-day practice in the healthcare system to make sure that it's living data, that it's integrated and used in care pathways and systems. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks, George. Max, I'm interested in your reflections on some of the impacts of only collecting data based on 2 gender data points, and also any positive stories you've got of when we did data was collected in a beyond binary form, what that's meant for people, for individuals, for being recognised, and for what that's meant for their care.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks, George, for sharing those points before. I think I'm going to jump off some of those. So I think when we're working in healthcare settings, what we've seen from the research that does exist is that there is a real lack of trust in healthcare settings from trans and non-binary, gender diverse, takatapui people because of their experiences that they have had. So particularly within sexual health, it's quite interesting because we have our priority populations as those who are typically underserved by healthcare services, including trans people. And so we really aim to empower people to make decisions that they want to around their own bodies. But when we're in community settings, we have to get such a huge amount of data from people in order to do like self-testing for STIs. So we have to know what people have, we have to know what people have contact with. And those are 2 points that aren't attached to identity. They're just about behavior and anatomy. And we have to figure out a way to ask those like privately, safely, and really, really fast when there's a lot of people around. So that's something that we've been working on for a while. And we have a little chart that people can just point to those things on them. So they don't have to say out loud, they don't have to identify with anything. And we explain why we're asking those questions so that we can set them up with the right test. So I think having, being informed about what you're telling somebody else about is really, really key to make people feel safe. And I would say probably 90% of the time that goes well within the community. Probably the only times when it's an issue is when largely cis people might laugh at the form and be like, "Oh, like you can assume what I have," and I'm like, "Oh, wrong audience, buddy." But those are things that we can often use as teaching tools in the community as well. And beyond that, because we have data that we use for our reporting as well, gender is useful for that. So I've always pushed for a blank field for gender but we similarly have on our forms male, female, gender diverse, or please specify. And I think there's another point around language there, is that it is always evolving. And what is considered best practice now is not going to be the case in a couple of years. And I think if we can set up our systems to be able to amend the language that we have and make that really easy, it's going to make it easy for us in the long term. Yeah, I think another gender is an option that I see on a lot of forms that people seem to be quite good with, because it's, rather than it being specifically othering, like other, it's one of many other options. I think, yeah, because non-binary is sometimes used as an umbrella term, but then a lot of people also don't identify with that. They might have culturally specific terms. Yeah, and I think being recognized in those cases can be really, really valuable. And then I think there's also the flip side of this conversation, which is, I guess, the privacy aspect of it. Like, why do people want to know? And yeah, I think that comes down to the really clear communication about why data is being collected in the first place. Then the visibility of that data. So we want it to be consistent across healthcare providers, so that if you change your, for example, your gender marker, you want your other healthcare providers to be able to be aware of that. But at the same time, I think being informed about where that's going to be used is really useful. I know there's a school system called KMAR, where they've been making changes to that. I understand, because we also do work in schools, and you can have pronouns as part of that system now, and you can also have there's a code for if somebody is trans, but sometimes those are made really visible in class settings. So I think what would be good to accompany these changes in the systems we have is all of those who use them to understand how privacy comes into that discussion as well. Yeah.
Can I also quickly jump in?
Absolutely, Claire.
Because I think health is a really good example of making sure the question you're asking is actually getting the answer that you think it is. I'm seeing this a bit in the Q&A as well, of people saying, we have to have gender for health purposes, or we have to have sex for health purposes. But so often that doesn't match up to what you're actually getting at. I mean, if you want to know if someone can get pregnant, gender won't tell you that, because they might be a trans woman who can't get pregnant, or a trans man or non-binary person who can get pregnant. Sex doesn't tell you that either, because it might be someone who is intersex, or it might be someone who has had a hysterectomy. It's not actually getting the answer that you think it is. So it's really important to be specific about, I do need to know something biological, potentially for this person's health, but what is it that I need to know, and what question will get me there?
I agree. And which, sort of from a privacy perspective, I mean, obviously is the reason why we're having this conversation. It is about, so why do you need to know this information? And it is about also doing this in the most respectful and privacy enhancing way possible, to allow the individual to feel safe. So as you've all been saying, this absolutely goes to trust, and trust in the services that are being provided. And individuals are not going to approach organisations where they feel that they're not trustworthy. So absolutely clear. And I am seeing those things coming through in the Q&As. Just to say to people, where you've asked questions about the nature of the research and things like that, we'll find out those details from Claire and others and post them after the session. But we do have, questions that go to things like, insurance systems. When underwriting health insurance, we need to ask questions regarding reproductive systems. How can we sensitively ask questions regarding this to our gender diverse whānau? That might be something that that George, you or Max might want to turn your minds to. I mean, how do we think about these things? But again, it goes to the question of why. Why do you need to know? George, you want to pick that one up?
I mean, I think that you captured it so beautifully, Claire. I was nodding vigorously in terms of actually getting to the heart of what you're needing to know and what questions will actually elicit that information. I guess from our point of view, the principle is a two-step process that allows sex assigned at birth to be captured distinct from gender, to allow an understanding of why someone may be non-binary or male identified and be accessing cervical smears or perinatal care services. So it's about moving away from, and in our healthcare settings, moving away from that conflation to open up the possibilities for self-determination around gender, separate to sex assigned at birth. In terms of actual recommendations for how that can best be done in fertility and perinatal care settings, that's something that will be coming out of our project a little bit further down the track, and we'll happily feed that back to you, Liz, at the Privacy Commission. And yeah, so we're not quite at that point of kind of the how, but certainly we're seeing a very clear rationale for the why.
Okay, great. Some of the other questions we've got here go to issues, I guess, about how you, the extent to which your the way that you collect gender inclusive information goes to the inclusivity of the service itself. So the difference between collecting things in an inclusive way, but then how that follows, what the follow through is in terms of the service provided. Max or George, you might want to comment on that, because I know that there are real issues about the extent to which that the way in which you collect the information actually follows the person through the service. Who should we start with? Max, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about an example of a gym that I went to that had a third option on their form about gender. It was like male, female, and then gender neutral as the third option. And I laughed a little bit at that, because I wasn't sure, you know, the reason why they were asking this question, or why they'd chosen the term gender neutral as a third kind of gender. But yeah, I think. Sorry, could you ask the question again, please?
Well, I guess my point is, I think what was coming through in the question was, you can collect gender appropriately at the front end, perhaps in a gender inclusive way, but that gender inclusive data collection needs to follow the individual through the service that they're receiving. And to what extent does that happen, and how can we ensure it does?
I guess leaving channels open for feedback around people's experiences of how their gender is being affirmed or not affirmed throughout their, I guess, use of services. I don't know if those forms of feedback are really accessible to people or are quite open to people, but I guess that's how we're going to know if people are having positive experiences, is if we're open to feedback, and if the feedback is, you know, able to be anonymous. Yeah.
It's really important, I think, that you don't just leave it at the form, but make sure that you've got training across staff and across the whole organization, because people are going to possibly be even more frustrated if you ask gender inclusive pronoun options, for instance, and then just don't use them. So it's really important to make sure you're not just collecting the right data, but then that's actually being, as you say, carried through the whole process.
Right.
And that's one of the key questions in the data privacy guide, is really not only how would you collect it and why, but what are you actually going to use it for? Are you using it today? What are you actually using it for? And making sure that it's understood, because often organizations actually realize, well, they're collecting it, but they're not even using it, let alone using it appropriately. And so that's just a key sort of privacy question. Common sense applies to this issue really nicely.
Yeah, and I'd really echo that you know, forms are an interface between people accessing services and people providing services. And if we dress up our forms and we don't support that with, you know, a comprehensive program of workforce education and health that ensures that all aspects of care are gender affirming and gender inclusive, then absolutely you will alienate people with inclusive forms that aren't backed up by inclusive practice. I think it's such an ethical responsibility to see data collection holistically as part of organisational wide movement towards inclusive and affirming practice. It can't be separate from.
Yeah, and in my memory, George, just in having some chats with you, is that in your research, you've got some examples of where the individual who's presenting, their follow-up in terms of things like, for example, smears, etc., might not actually reflect the information that's collected at the front end of the engagement with the individual. And again, that reflects this what we're talking about here, which is that the way that you approach the individual in an inclusive way at the front end needs to actually follow them through the service.
Yeah, and both ways, both by taking up what people have said around their gender and reflecting that in the care provided to them, but also being very careful to not see that filter down into data issues whereby someone may not be recalled for a smear based on need based on their sex assigned at birth because of how their gender has been recorded in the system, and that conflation again. So that, you know, I guess we're seeing a picture emerge of emotional and mental health implications of constantly being erased and invisible to healthcare, but also some very real and tangible health risks and data system issues around smear recall are a perfect example.
Actually, we do have a question here, which is, can you provide examples to highlight what sort of services have been taken away from people based on non-inclusive gender options on forms? Max, George?
Yeah, I think smears is a great example, as well as options around safety considerations if you're pregnant or not. So if you don't click whatever that you're female, then you might not get those follow-up questions, which could be a real risk to your safety. As well as I think the overarching point that people are less likely to trust and engage with a healthcare system that they don't feel represented in, and they don't feel seen in, and they don't feel safe in as well. So that's kind of, yeah, follows through everything.
I'd say what services aren't taken away from you when you're not eligible to those services, when you can't be known, where you don't feel trusted and seen and safe.
Absolutely. There are also quite a few questions which really just go back again to some of the points you made earlier, Claire and Sarah, at the beginning of the session around just the absolute basics of how you might start into this journey. You know, questions about, for example, can you mitigate risks by collecting sex, i.e. male, female, as opposed to gender when it makes sense to do so? And I just thought it might be useful to come back to the initial points that we were making around how you find your way into this journey and the sort of questions that you might actually, you know, ask yourself at the start of it. Claire, I might come to you on this.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question because a lot of Spark's journey on this, it started before forming the relationship with Outline, but I think it has been quite fundamental to being able to, throughout all these processes, really kind of work with each other in terms of bringing shared expertise to these issues. So Spark have obviously rainbow people, trans people working there, but they're not necessarily representative of those communities. So being able to come to our organization, which is itself connected in to broader communities, I think has been really valuable for being able to answer some of these questions and figure out what works organizationally. That said, I do think the Beyond Binary Code is a great place to start, because it's not just the idea of this code. It really is going back to those principles of, well, what are these different questions that we tend to ask? Why are we asking them? It really does step you through that process of, what is your business? Are you doing marketing? Are you a health-related organization? And thinking about what the different needs are that fit your organization. I might also, because it's kind of tangentially relevant, people were asking about the connection to the New Zealand standards.
Mm-hmm.
And as we said, those really did inform this process. I would say that they're more focused on research, whereas this is very much intended to be useful for organizations, for business, for companies. And that's the angle that Spark is able to bring and provide to others, and hopefully have others take up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, there were quite a few questions in here around the difference between the stats guidance, which is currently around 3 gender options, and the 5 ordering fields that are in the beyond binary code. And I think the answer there is, as you say, one is research focused, but also we're evolving and learning as we go. And so, as both Max and George have said, there's a bit of dissensus out there, but it's important that we are working with the communities and trying to find ways of best reflecting need out there, and the language will change, as Max said, as we go along. There is a question here which says that they would love to hear about how these approaches can be implemented in a health research setting, and that it feels like when you have to collect gender for statistical purposes, sort of, are there people pushing that boundary, and sort of, do we need it at all? i.e., do we need gender at all? I think we've answered that question, but perhaps just to circle back round, I think certainly from a privacy perspective, we would say, if you don't need it, don't collect it. But I think we've heard from George and from Max, and there's bound to be other examples as well. There is a very real need to collect gender in certain circumstances. Do you want to reiterate that point, either of you? All right. Many of these questions, I think, are asking some of the same issues. And I've got a question here about interested to know whether it's coming from a Te Whatu Ora or DHB perspective. And again, I mean, this seems to be unsafe or adverse issues for patients. Many of the same issues, in fact. I'm just going to swing back round to issues associated with how then we ensure that that we do understand the why. Claire, in terms of this, the resource map, the roadmap that is in the beyond binary approach, can you step us through some of the ways in which you actually would approach those questions in terms of the for particular businesses?
I don't have it in front of me, so I'm trying to do this from memory, but I did see someone was asking about honorifics in terms of like Mr., Ms., etc. And that's another one of the ones that is covered. I mean, I always feel like as a country, we're a bit informal and it's strange to see people using those honorifics, but that is something to consider if that's something you need, is again, is that something that you're going to be addressing people by? And if so, incorporating that. A lot of the questions that we asked in that survey were around sort of, when do you think it would be appropriate for people to be asking for various types of data? And people sort of had varying opinions in terms of, if you're addressing me by name in mail outs, or if you're going to be sort of doing customer service, then yes, maybe you need to use pronouns. Again, the code is more focused on supporting businesses, companies, organizations than it is doing sort of broad governmental level census data collection, which I know some people are talking about that sort of stuff as well. So it's very much thinking about, well, what is the user coming to us for? What do we actually practically need information in terms of making that experience comfortable and useful to them? And I think that's always a really good guiding question is, are we asking this question because we want the data as our organization, or are we asking it so that we can actually provide a better experience? And that, I think you can't go wrong if you're thinking about, is this to improve the experience of the person coming to us?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you take the approach that you should also be telling the person why you're collecting the data.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't sort of pass the red face test when you explain to them what you're going to use the data for, then clearly you don't need it. I mean, that applies for any privacy situation, but it's a really good, it's one thing to say, do we need the data? And then you say, well, actually, we've got to tell the person why we're collecting it.
Mm-hmm.
And you may feel differently as an organisation about being upfront about your actual reasons. They may not look quite so good on paper after all.
And this is all, I was just going to say very quickly, all entirely in line with the Privacy Act. It's those 12 principles. But something about gender, people don't always think through the implications of collecting it. George, go for it.
I was just going to add to that, you know, what shifts would we see if we saw a culture of informed consent for data collection, and that was integrated into data rather than data collection being kind of habitual or assumption based, then I think we'd see a real cultural shift in data collection practices.
Absolutely. So, you know, really coming back to those points that you've all been hammering, which are around, you know, why do you need to collect this in the first place? If you are collecting it, is it accurate? Which is something that we've spent quite a bit of time talking about in terms of how do we actually reflect gender appropriately. And how are we being transparent about this? Do people know that we're collecting it and why we're collecting it? And I agree with you entirely that the red face test is a critically important one. Now, if I had to actually tell people why I was collecting this information, how I was going to use it, you know, would I? And if I can't actually explain how I'm going to use it, do I need it in the first place?
And we'd add to that, not only why do I need it, but also how will it be stored, and how will it be used, and how will safety be assured if someone's gender is distinct from sex assigned at birth. How will their safety be assured to ensure that they get the correct recalls for screening and services, as well as are shown respect and dignity through their correct reference to their gender by their care providers.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to a point that I think you said that somebody had made in the Q&A about, I guess this issue of collecting gender data is quite complex, and so why not just collect sex? I think you'd lose a lot in that process. I think it's also, sex is much more complex than just being a binary as well, so that's potentially worth acknowledging.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're probably not going to get a great read on the kind of people that you're serving, either in a healthcare setting as well as other settings potentially, because it's not as much of a fixed signifier as I think people sometimes think it is.
I agree. And I think just picking up, totally agree, Max. I think just picking up on the points that all of you have made, if you do collect what is sensitive information and goes to the core of who somebody is, then you are the kaitiaki for that information. You need to use it carefully for the purposes for which it was given to you, and you need to make sure that it's safe, it's kept safe. Only the people who need to see it.
Right.
And if it doesn't need to be retained, then you shouldn't be retaining it. So all of those critical things that go with safe data are just as important or more important for gender data. We're just about out of time. So I'm going to wrap up by saying thank you so much to our panel. I think we could have kept going all afternoon. This is obviously a topic that people are really interested in. People do feel nervous about it, but I think that what we've shown here today is that, you know, the beyond binary work that Spark have done with Outline demonstrates you can collect information safely, and that you know, that you can have an approach which allows you to think through really carefully, you know, your way into this, why you're collecting it, how you're collecting it, how you're storing it, and collecting it in a way that is respectful and inclusive. You know, the beyond binary code is, that Spark's developed with Outline isn't the only way. We've just discussed that. But it ultimately goes to your purpose and the way in which you're seeking to serve the community that you're working with. So it just behoves me to say thank you so much to the panel for bringing your wisdom. Thank you to Spark and to Outline for giving us the prompt to run this session and for demonstrating that it is possible. Thank you to George and to Max for just making it so clear why this is important, and for also giving us the real encouragement to keep moving in this space and to keep improving.
Can I add one final thought?
Absolutely.
I think we've been rightfully really focused on the benefits for trans and non-binary people today, but I do just want to make the point that this is actually really beneficial for all people. I'm cisgender, but I don't want to be marketed to as a woman based on stereotypes just because the company feels like that they should have my data. I think it really opens up and liberates us to think beyond gender stereotypes to actually who are the people that we're serving and what are their needs.
Absolutely. Go you, Claire. No, that's absolutely correct. And actually, as I said at the very beginning of the session, privacy actually is about ensuring that people's identity is respected and people have the ability to really figure out who they are and to be marketed to in a way which reflects who they are too. So with that said, again, thank you so much for being on the panel. I know this is a conversation that we'll continue to have. And can I say thank you all to everybody who's joined PrivacyLive. We'll make sure that we post material from this session, both the recording, but also any of the website materials, research that's been referenced to. So, ka kite from me, take care and enjoy the rest of your week.